Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar called National Minorities versus Nationalism and Populism, which is the first activity on Yen Digital Summer. From the technical side, we will have a talk with Professor Petai for around 30 minutes. And after that, we will have a short round of questions, which we will collect in writing. You can see the small chat. Some people already wrote something nice there. If you have any questions to Professor Petai, please post it in the chat and mark it as question. You know, the small question mark above the messenger field. When you click on this, it becomes blue. From these questions, we will choose as many as the time allows to post them to Professor Petai. You can add questions anytime, so you're warmly welcome. So guys, you already wrote. Where are you writing from? Okay, we have here Switzerland. Serbia is there. From Bern, Joanna, our president of Yen, is also there. Maëlys from Flensburg. Blanca from Hungary. Martina from Ljubljana. Till, also from Flensburg. Wonderful. Welcome, guys. Italy is also here. Belgium, Bretagne, wonderful. Okay, that sounds pretty nice. We will publish this recording and we will of the webinar, and so you can access us afterwards on our YouTube channel. And this webinar is open and not everybody is familiar with Yen. I would like to shortly introduce us. Youth of European Nationalities Yen, or in German, Jugend Europäischer Volksgruppen JEF, is the largest network of youth organizations of autochthonous, national and linguistic minorities in Europe. Represent the interest of young people from these minorities. Currently, 41 member organizations from 18 countries are represented in Yen since its founding in 1984 on Kniesberg in North Schleswig in Denmark. Yen has been advocating for the interest of minorities with a special focus on young people. That means that Yen is run and led by young people for young people, and it sees itself as a self-determined and self-organized youth organization whose activity is carried out and determined by youth. To introduce myself, I'm Jakob Schäfer. I'm the convener of communication in Yen, and I'm a Lusatian Sorb from Saxony in Germany. And I work as a journalist and moderator in a TV station called Central German Broadcasting, MDR, Mitteldeutscher Rundfunk in German. Usually we organize 3 or 4 large events during the year. Unfortunately, in 2020, we were forced to cancel 2 of these seminars. As an alternative, we are launching the Yen Digital Summer, a series of activities under the motto, Think Beyond Borders, running until July. Even when at home and not able to travel, we want to keep our network active and connected and reflect on the current situation as well as the challenges national, ethnic and linguistic minorities face. This first webinar will be followed by others with guests bringing their expertise and perspective. Besides that, we will organize discussion rounds for young people from our network, as well as e-training in the middle of June. With this first webinar, we wanted to provide some basic inputs on national minorities, but also to reflect on the current situations connected with the outbreak of COVID-19. For that, we found a perfectly suited guest who we want to warmly welcome, Professor Dr. Vello Petai, who is the new director of the European Center of Minority Issues in Flensburg. Dr. Petai, hello, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Welcome and thank you.
Could you tell us more about yourself, about the ECMI, the European Center for Minority Issues in Flensburg?
Absolutely. First, let me, of course, welcome in particular those people who are tuning in from Flensburg and maybe Schleswig-Holstein, because this is where we are located. So right on the Danish-German border, and the ECMI has existed for almost 25 years now, working in the field of than minority issues and the study of minority issues. Perhaps we can turn the next slide and everyone can see the background of our organization, as well as what we do. The colored clusters on the left tell you the basic sort of areas in which we work in, be it culture and diversity, equality and inclusion, conflict security, politics and society, justice and governance. These are the ways in which we understand minority issues and the different places where minority issues are manifested. Then in those areas, we conduct trainings, we do academic research, we do policy advising, and we do education, which I think this event here would be part of. And last but not least, our organization is comprised first and foremost of our founders. And these are three governments, the Danish government, of course, the Land Schleswig-Holstein, as well as the German federal government. All three of them contribute to our basic funding. And that supports a staff of about 14 researchers and other support people, as well as a library and a number of the different sort of projects and activities and publications that we put out. And then last but not least, we go beyond our center into different projects outside of Germany, indeed, and work with either governments or NGOs in the given instance, be it Moldova, Ukraine. We have an office in Kosovo, work also in Serbia with projects, have been in Georgia, any number of other countries. So it's an international organization in that sense, working both in sort of academic research, but also education and people on the ground, if you will, as well. So that's who we are, and I'm delighted to share that with you, and as well as talk about the broader issues of nationalism and populism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing. This year with Yen, we set the focus on the position, role, and reality of young people from national, ethnic, and linguistic minorities in a changing world in the light of current developments, challenges, and opportunities. One of these developments we have noticed is the rising wave of nationalism across Europe and populistic narrative often aiming at different minorities. To understand the concepts of nationalism and populism and interrelations, we want to start with those basics. Could you give us a short definition of these two concepts, nationalism and populism?
Yes, absolutely. Let's start with nationalism. It's probably the better known. It's the longer sort of existing word that's been out there. Of course, some argue since the 18th century even. But there are many facets to the idea. And one of them is, of course, that what you could also call ethnocentrism. That is that when people feel that they want to either push their own national identity, ethnic identity, they want to perhaps have a feeling of superiority with that feeling of ethnic identity vis-a-vis others, and they want to express it and sort of push it forward more strongly than they previously have, and indeed impose it perhaps on others. So there's that, and I think that's very much of a common knowledge or a common standard understanding of nationalism, that it's somehow an aggressive attitude toward others, toward strangers, toward people in an outgroup. And it can overlap with populism, but populism in some senses is also its own phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that populism focuses on a kind of political rhetoric and a political discourse that says that the people are important and that we need to defend the people vis-a-vis some kind of elite that is out there, that is somehow taking advantage of the people and abusing the people, and we need to tear down that elite, and that is somehow a secretive elite, and all of this kind of conspiracy mindedness toward that part of society. And so you can see that that's a slightly different mindset than your ethnic, ethnocentrism. and it can actually exist without any kind of reference to ethnicity, because if we can just be against some kind of banking elite or corporate elite or whatever international elite that is out there. And so the two, however, can overlap when that same populism begins to say that the elite that we are fighting against is actually from some kind of different ethnic group, and so it's an outgroup, and that's what scholars often call nativist populism, and that's when the two come together. So if you want a very simple empirical example, people look at, for instance, the so-called leftist populism, which we right now often see in a place like Venezuela, where you hear Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him, talking very loudly about el pueblo and these kinds of things, but there's never any nationalism to it necessarily. And then in contrast to, I think, what we see in many European countries now, be it the France with the former Front National, or in some Eastern European countries, then that's more of the nativist populism, where it's actually focused against external people, but also minorities in the country. So we will see, and probably talk about, of course, examples where populist leaders turn nativist, and in particular against their own national minority groups.
And how would you estimate the situation in Europe in the last years in regards to nationalism?
Well, nationalism is growing in both or many of the senses that I've talked about. Certainly the idea of ethnocentrism is growing. People are more concerned about and more defensive vis-a-vis other national groups. Of course, there's a certain amount of reverberation left over from the migration wave of 2015 and the refugee wave. So there are sensitivities lingering within people about the ethnic diversity that has grown in Europe. But there is also, I think, amongst governments, of course, nationalist policy, more exclusionary policy, be it on immigration itself or on social policy toward let's say non-citizens or migrants, all of those things. And then there's a third version of this nationalism, which I'd like to raise, and that is the nationalism that is linked to authoritarianism. Because when democracy declines, as it has in many European countries, it moves toward that authoritarianism. There are authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin, or some argue now Viktor Orban, or maybe even in Serbia, that those leaders also appeal to that national sentiment more and more, and so their kind of political rule becomes not just a authoritarian one, but often even a nationalist authoritarian one. So we even have that nationalism creeping forward in that form as well.
So we can say there is a rise of nationalism over all around the Europe. Or there are also states or regions where it's not so strong rising?
Well, clearly, those countries that have gone authoritarian and have adopted a more nationalist position. I mean, if you think about Russia and what it did in Crimea, that is a very nationalist approach and move. But other countries that have remained democratic, then the sort of nationalism that is growing there is much more linked to the ethnocentrism that I talked about, in terms of people themselves, simply average individuals being a little bit more sensitive toward ethnic diversity than they perhaps used to be. But that doesn't mean that it's less important. I mean, that may in fact be more important because it manifests itself on the streets. People are then suddenly more wary of each other and are somehow taking that out even more. And so you may even have greater confrontation on the micro level through that nationalism, that form of nationalism. But there are other countries, I think, that yes are holding in there. But the sort of wave, if you will, of multiculturalism that we talked about 10, 15, 20 years ago is definitely under threat, if not under some kind of shadow at the moment.
What impact does it have on national, ethnic, and linguistic minorities? Would you say they're now more often discriminated, more often targeted by the nationalistic movements?
Yes, I mean, I think that the ideas of nationalism and when we talk about nationalism, they very much go hand in hand, of course, with minorities. But what's important, if only from an analytical point of view, is to look at also the kinds of minorities and how it's different. Because I think in general, we talk about ethnic diversity overall. We know that every single country in Europe has dozens and dozens of ethnic groups living in their populations, preserving their ethnic identities, and enriching their cultures through those ethnic identities. But when we look at what countries are doing and what political movements are doing and basic ethnic interaction, how that is happening, it does depend on what kind of ethnic minority group we're talking about. And I think then there it's interesting. How is it? And we need to analyze this actually in greater detail, and I hope my center will be able to do that. Is to think about, okay, how are indeed Sorbs being impacted, as opposed to, if we take the German case, Turks in Germany, or maybe recent refugees from the Middle East versus perhaps even Asian minorities in Germany, or African minorities. So, there are different groups also, and how they're established in their societies, and where they're living, and that also makes the picture a little bit more diverse, and it definitely needs to be studied, and it also needs to be studied from a policy point of view. What should we be doing at the governmental level to help those groups, or to figure out how they're being individually affected by this rise in ethnocentric feeling?
Hmm. I mean, how can you see the impact of these two concepts of nationalism and populism every day life? I mean, me as Sorbian, we got often attacked by neo-Nazis on Sorbian events for youth. How can you see this in everyday life, the impact?
Well, I think that's very much like what you described. I mean, we need to find out how it is that let's say a traditional festival, that if it's organized by Sorbs or Frisians or Danes here in Flensburg, in what way will they be attacked or necessarily abused in some way, or is it also, let's say, the mundane attack against a refugee shelter, or even as we know very well from the long 10 years of that underground movement in Eastern Germany, I mean, where they were attacking restaurants, Kurdish and Turkish restaurants. So, some of this exists out of the basic ethnocentrism. It does depend how strong those neo-Nazi movements are, and how we track them, and how we monitor what they're doing, and also, of course, educate people not to fall into their trap.
Do you think people are more prone to become nationalistic because the culture allows or even promotes that?
I think it's as they say, a sort of a push and pull kind of phenomenon, in the sense that, yes, the culture needs to give a signal. The people within society, authoritative figures within society, need to give a very clear signal about what they think about some of these things happening. But there is also a broader contextual, dimension to it. Not least through the wave of migration and refugees, and the way in which our diversity is challenged or augmented by certain events. So that we are still facing. I mean, we've been through these things before in Europe as well, of course, with the Balkan Wars, bringing a lot of people over, other waves and crises that transform our diversity, that put it under stress at times, and we have to come through that sort of challenge with policy, with understanding, with education, and I hope we can stand up against that now. But of course, we also have new elements of that problem, and one of that is social media and media in general, with certain media channels, of course, hyping and magnifying some of this ethnocentrism, and that's something that we didn't face, let's say, 20 years ago. So as a social scientist, I'm always examining the combinations of these shifts, not only of people, but of also context, technology, and see where that leaves us moving forward.
You mentioned already education as a way to deal with that. Do you have any other strategies, tools to deal with this topic?
Overall, I mean, I think it is, of course, multifaceted. If we take within a country, of course, its own systems, as I said before, it's also its ability to talk about these things openly and to remind people about what our values are as a society. Then if we look at, let's say, the European level, and how the European Union can or cannot influence some of these situations. We talk about the situation of minorities or Roma, for instance, and the discrimination that they might be facing in particularly now, but even beforehand. You know, can the European Union do something from the outside? And if we think of that nationalist authoritarianism that I talked about before, then how can we tone down some of the rhetoric that might be coming from a Viktor Orban or another sort of semi-authoritarian leader in Europe? And that's yet another level that, you know, we need to address somehow. So there's a lot of fronts to this war, if you will, or battle. And that makes it a little bit more complicated, but if we're aware of them all, then we can get people to work on each of them.
Now with the corona outbreak, we witness how the borders are closing and the states use a bit of the national interest narrative, concentrating on protecting themselves. Do you think this crisis brings any change regarding development of nationalism or populism?
Well, somewhat. I mean, there was clearly a danger of this in some countries. Many of you have probably heard about the fact that Hungary adopted, the parliament in Hungary adopted this law, giving the government absolute power for the duration of the crisis. Now it seems to be coming to an end there, and maybe there'll be sort of return to normal, at least in terms of constitutional government. And that, you know, could have been the model more broadly, and it may be still in other countries as well. And we were not out of the crisis fully yet either. Of course, everyone talks about a possible second wave, et cetera, et cetera. So that has been sort of on the governmental level, one of the worries. But on the micro level, on the day-to-day level, of course, there have been run-ins and confrontations. Again, most prominently, unfortunately, within the Roma community, in terms of media coverage, in terms of police and authorities targeting that minority in particular because of some perception that they are either violating public health rules or deemed somehow a greater risk to the rest of the population. This kind of stigmatization is something that we've written about in our Minorities blog and reported on both in Eastern Europe and in Spain and in other countries. So it is unfortunately a wider spread problem than just in particular areas. And I think that we need to gather more information about this to prove and to demonstrate and to monitor and know about what's been going on. And if indeed more, let's say, things underneath the radar have been happening that we need to know about European-wide.
What are other consequences of corona-related measures for the national minorities?
Well, I think there's one element that has been talked about probably most of all in the United States, but it's, I think, definitely an issue here in Europe, and that is the linkages between access to healthcare and being part of a minority group. Again, in the context of the United States, it's been talked about in relation to African Americans and Latinos as having fundamentally, of course, often more difficult health issues to begin with because of a lack of access to healthcare stretching over many decades, and therefore adding something like corona means that they are susceptible and are infected and affected much more. So are those the kinds of patterns that are also emerging amongst the minorities in Europe? Can we study this and see this? And again, it's evident, I think, in groups very vulnerable socioeconomic groups like Roma, but often others as well. It depends on how much maybe the community is stuck together, or how what ways in which its social life has been disrupted or not. And it's true that minorities also suffer from the lockdown. I mean, the closing of borders, especially if they're trans-border national groups, then this is a period of strain. And we know that it's slowly opening up now, and the borders are getting better. But nevertheless, this will be something that will be felt for some time to come.
Do you think there are any places, countries, that the situation is much more alarming than in others, for example?
Well, I think that certainly those countries, as we well know, where there are larger Roma populations, these become very quickly targets of stigmatization, and then across other autochthonous minorities, it's not clear that too much has been heard. I mean, we know that the cultural life of these groups has been affected, with festivals being cancelled, and other rituals and real cultural elements of the community being undermined. Whether there are, however, the kind of health effects and the real sort of impact on their well-being, physical well-being, and that kind of ramification, we need to hear more. So again, if members of Yen want to write to us and tell us their stories about their communities, they should definitely do that, because we're looking to collect that information for our blog. If people want to write for that blog, they can contact us. But we also look to have perhaps a repository of this kind of information for everyone to know about moving forward.
How would you wish we as national minorities, but also as a society, can come out of the Corona crisis?
Oh gosh, I think that one of the key words here, of course, is solidarity, and it's a very interesting phenomena and a concept. I mean, we're working on it very intensely right now, because it on the one hand tells you that yes, people are hanging together. I mean, we feel a lot of solidarity when especially in the beginning, about the people who are suffering, and the ways in which we could all pitch in, and we could clap our hands on our balconies every night in solidarity with healthcare workers and things like that. But then there's also the opposite, which is the closing of borders. It's the blocking off of others and outsiders, so that we're not affected by some kind of infiltration or infection. And that is reducing a kind of solidarity in our world. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how long, or I mean, how those different types of solidarity play themselves out, and whether that kind of lockdown solidarity, which we maintain inside but not outside of the border, is the model that will get us through this crisis without too much sort of undermining of our social fabric, or will we be able to maintain a universal solidarity, which means in particular, for instance, in relation to finding a vaccine. I think that the World Health Organization and others are actively trying to harness the medical skills of the whole world in putting together a vaccine and make it accessible for everyone in the world, right? Whereas some countries are saying that, well, no, actually, we need to protect it and make the vaccine for ourselves and give it to only our people. So I think there's another element of this kind of solidarity, and a big question mark as to how we'll come out of the crisis, in 2 or 3 years.
For sure. Now, also, what is the topic? Solidarity is also a topic of Yen, and we learn so that solidarity among diverse minorities. Now we have a lot of questions from the audience. I would like to share some with us, and that's why I have to change this one. No, that's the wrong one. So are there any questions? Okay, here. Okay, I just have to put it out. Okay. Let me see. Okay, we'll wait a second. Okay, there's a lot of questions here, so we have to pick one. Give me a second. I have to read them first also. Yes, it looks interesting. Okay. Yeah, okay, I think we have a nice question. Tina, those who are supposed to educate people and remind them of the values are very often government's agents, and I believe that this education has to be systemic. How do we educate if governments are advocating nationalism and discrimination? What do you think about this, Professor Petai?
Well, I think the first answer, if at all possible in that particular government, is to vote them out. And to mobilize and to also, of course, reveal these issues and very clearly, counter the particular claims or indeed perhaps even lies or falsehoods that are being advocated. This is a very fundamental question. I completely agree, because the amount of this kind of, if you will, noise and indeed destructive noise that is out there is growing, has been growing, and is, as I said in the very beginning, even more being amplified by today's social technology. And I'm sure many of you heard that Twitter just recently, of course, posted a warning on one of Donald Trump's tweets, and you saw that the firestorm, I'll use the polite word firestorm, that went out, that started from that, and that's going to be a very fierce confrontation. So it's not only going to be the individual speeches, but it's the fora in which those messages are given, and how those forums are going to be changed and challenged in this context. So the battle is going to take some time, I'm afraid, but we have to stick to it, because it is the central kind of core component of our values that we are fighting for.
That's right. Thank you for this answer. I'm looking for another question from the audience. There's so much. Sorry. Okay, we have this one. Pia asked, I think everyone can read this. I will not read it for you. Minorities themselves.
Hey.
What do you mean of this, Professor Petai?
Indeed. This does point to, of course, situations where minorities, if you will, are sort of nested in each other, and it points to an even greater diversity in a particular situation. One can think of an area in which we have worked in as a center, the western areas, Ukraine, bordering on Moldova, bordering on Bulgaria. There are multiple groups there together, and we see that as well when administrative change is taking place. And in Ukraine, for instance, we worked on this project looking at how territorial decentralization and the making of larger units, territorial gramadas, they're called, of course, meant that some minorities were now being packed into larger units and becoming even smaller and perhaps less able to contribute and participate in political and social life. So this kind of problem is out there. And the hierarchies that are developing, yes, these have to be unpacked. I mean, I'm sure that in many ways they're linked to long-standing, social, political, economic relationships, and I think that it comes back a little bit to also the discussion that I was trying to bring out beforehand, that indeed, what is it like if we have here in Flensburg, quite specifically, Danish minority with also a Turkish minority, and perhaps even refugee populations that have settled here following the refugee waves in 2015, right? Are these groups in a hierarchy of some way? Is it that the Danish minority is more welcome in the Staatsrat, or is it what should the others do? These, of course, speak to the general diversity and needs to be managed overall. But then, of course, there are also legal and, let's say, political statuses in terms of citizenship or others that come into play as well. So the hierarchies, unfortunately, do exist, sometimes for these legal grounds, but on a level of cultural diversity, let's hope that government officials are dealing with everyone on equal terms, because everyone's culture and identity should be equal.
Thank you for this question, Pia. Thank you for the answer. There are so much questions. I have some helpers from the office, some help, so they will send me nice questions. Okay. There we have a question from Linda. Do you see the tendency within minorities communities, especially that youth members, of avoiding populist attacks by denying that cultural, linguistic, or ethnic in their identity?
Very good question. I don't believe that we've been able to do that kind of sociological research, if you will. I mean, that is clearly something that would require kind of focus groups, really, on the ground examination. Perhaps some larger surveys would reveal that, but again, surveys tend to be across the general population, and it's difficult to actually finance a survey of that sort amongst a smaller minority group, because of course getting all of those people takes more effort and time. So I would hope that of course is not taking place. And again, I would encourage the people watching this, if they are members of a minority, to send us their stories, or send even Linda her stories in Kiel. And see, where we're at with this phenomenon, because I think it could well be the case, in which case, we need to act as a center, as individuals, citizens, and as governments.
Yeah. Thank you, Linda, for this nice question. We have another question from Nina Henke. Can you give examples of successful political policies which make integration and mutual enrichment more faultless and effectively? Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Again, I think that there are many levels to this phenomenon of integration and integration policy. Of course, it starts with governments adopting national integration strategies that, if they're successful and well thought out, then they will move down into specific areas like, cultural support, linguistic interaction, or maybe even socioeconomic policies to deal with, structural socioeconomic inequality. And then, but I think that many cities, of course, in particular here in Germany, promote these kinds of things on a local level and work with local communities to actually, be closer to the individuals that want the help and want the assistance. So I, as an Estonian coming originally from the United States, can talk less about the individual German cities, but we have been looking into ways of actually measuring integration policies. There are things like a thing called MyPEX, which is an index looking at state policies for immigrant populations and the integration of immigrant populations. So it's looking at citizenship regulations and labor regulations for getting labor permits and things like that, but also cultural support and things like that. So there are ways of doing it more systematically. but ultimately looking at single cities. Of course, I've heard a lot talked about Frankfurt, and perhaps even Berlin or other places. So that would be a great thing to collaborate on.
Okay, thank you. And we have two more questions. I would like to share the next one with you. Davor have a nice question. Countries like France and Greece don't recognize minorities. Would that not be considered discriminatory? Some countries get more attention than others in terms of nationalistic governments. Some get less or none at all. Why is this? Why are some countries off the hook when it comes to discriminatory policies? Spain's actions in Catalonia would be another good example.
Yes, very good point. Very good point. Indeed, there has been attention focused on or paid to what are called denier countries. France and Greece as being very prominent ones in this respect. And this shows that there is, of course, a different understanding of kind of minorities and who minorities are, and what is the national identity, if you will. And there is a very strong, let's say, institution in France of a common, arguably open French, acceptance and national identity. But as we well know, of course, it's also the place where the Front National was created already in the 1980s. So in that respect, a move towards open recognition and accommodation of minority groups in France and in other countries would be, I think, welcome overall. And then if we turn to those countries where there are, in fact, very direct, let's say, confrontations and tensions, like Spain over with Catalonia, then these are moments where, of course, very compact and traditionally settled minority groups, albeit part of a federation, if you will, of Spanish regions, but nevertheless feeling that they are not happy in this community and want to separate out. How is that dealt with? And my sense is that, of course, there are legal structures and constitutional structures that are there in Spain that make it very difficult, or in the eyes of Madrid at least, to give way. And of course, they're worried about the further expansion of other secessionist areas of Spain. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that the people of Catalan, in some kind of majority, it would seem at the moment, are dissatisfied with this relationship and want to find a renegotiated, or if not even separated, existence. So whether, again, we saw this in the United Kingdom with Scotland. These are big challenges in another way, right? They're less linked to the populism. They're less linked, perhaps, to the nationalism. They're not taking place in an authoritarian context. There is clear democratic procedure and dialogue going on, although it's strained, we know. So that gives a little bit of hope. What's most interesting, and this is where we've actually done some research also in the last couple of weeks, is any of this solved by the European Union? And is there a European level to this question in any way? And there, of course, it's very tricky because the European Union is not there to mediate between individual parts of countries or minorities and their governments. So there may not be too much recourse or solution to be found in Brussels. But it's clear that the rest of the European community does monitor and will monitor as best it can the way in which this problem can be solved.
Thank you so much, Davor, for your question. We have one more question, I think, I would like to share with you from the audience. Give me a second. Okay, Joanna Bailey is asking, from the outside, minorities are often seen as nationalistic or maybe ethnocentric is a better word. How can minorities be made more accessible and understandable for the majority? What role does the youth play in this? That's a nice question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that yes, in relation to the very first part of the question, that element of yes, sort of ethnocentrism of a minority would seem to be there, but of course this is just a manifestation, an expression of ethnic identity, in its core. The idea of a national minority necessarily being overly nationalistic or indeed ethnocentric toward others within its smaller community is theoretically possible, but of course less prevalent than the overall majority, of course, somehow impacting negatively on a minority. How can minorities be made more accessible and understandable? That is, I think, again, the multi-level process of information, research, dialogue, interaction. I think that for youth, clearly Yen is a fantastic place to start and to contribute to, because it is strengthening both people's togetherness as European nationalities, but then also giving information, communicating information about who the people are. I was showing everyone else that I've also been reading up on what Yen has been doing. Perhaps an older publication, but I myself has learned so much from the variety and the diversity. And I think that when people also show how they're parts of their national communities as well, I mean in a larger sense, that they are, as we heard Jakob say, he's working in his MDR news and broadcasting. That's part of the way in which he's communicating and showing what is part of his identity. I don't know how much you get to report about Sorbs, but anyways, it's a way of demonstrating that we are part of the community, and I think that isolationism, of course, would be the wrong way to do it. So the more that young people go out and project themselves, I think that's a very good thing.
It is. Thank you. We don't have so much time anymore. I would like to share one more question. It comes from Pia, the last question for tonight. Okay. I would be interested to hear, how do you see the role of youth, and here especially young minority members, in rebuilding their society after this crisis? What do you think?
Well, we all have a role to play there. Of course, an easy thing to say here is that the current crisis, namely the Corona crisis, is one that has been also disproportionate in its effects vis-a-vis generations. And we know that a vast majority of the Corona infected as well as the Corona dead were of older generations. And so there is an interesting element, a generational element to what's going on. I don't know that it's too present, but we feel it a little bit, and to the level that yes, young people are somehow seeing that we can move around and not be affected by this more, and schools may be open because younger children will not get the illness, etc., etc. So there's going to be a way in which young people will have to help pick up the pieces and carry the societies forward. And minorities will have to, see where this crisis has left them, again, in terms of the issues that we've talked about, the possible stigmatization, the socioeconomic disadvantages that may have come out, in particular in healthcare, that need to be researched, that need to be gathered empirically. And then the broader sort of elements of populism and nationalism and ethnocentrism that we feel. And young people have to, study and monitor that and fight against that, as we said, through social media and through political participation and activism. And so I see, a lot of fronts across all of the topics that we've had: the nationalism, the populism, the Corona, the healthcare, identities, and so more power to us all.
Thank you. We will work on this, actually. Thank you also to the audience for taking your time and for asking questions. I have a last question now to you, Professor Petai. Do you have anything else to share? Would you want to share with us now? You can use the stage to spread your message or anything you want to share.
Well, I think that I've said quite a bit already in relation to what young people in particular can do, and we are going to continue as a center to focus on the Corona issues, and so we welcome any kind of contact. As I said before, we have a minorities blog that people can contribute to and report their information, or just send us stories that they know about. We have an internship program for people who want to actually come to our center, work with us. We have a beautiful building here right in downtown Flensburg, right on the harbor. So we've hosted a lot of those people. And so there are many ways in which we look forward to interacting with any and everyone who's been watching this terrific webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you a lot to our guest, Professor Petai, as well for your interest, time, and insights into the subjects. For those from our network, we invite to take part at we take part in the discussion rounds. Next week, Thursday, 4th of June. Link to the event on the webinar event page, and in the small groups you can share your personal experiences on how you have been impacted by the Corona crisis. Besides that, in 2 weeks we will offer another webinar with the Young European 2020 with Maria Anatasova from Bulgaria, who is recognized as Young European of the Year 2020 for her outstanding commitments to supporting Roma youth and creating equal opportunities. If you have any feedback or questions, you can write in the comments on the event Facebook page, or just write to our Yen office at yenny.org. You can also follow our future activities on our homepage, yenny.org, or on our social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook page. Thank you so much, Professor Petai, for this nice webinar, for this nice questions from the audience, and for this interesting answers. I wish you a nice evening and see you at the next webinar. Goodbye and thank you. Božeme, ďakujem. Thank you. Dankeschön. Ahoj.